During this past year, virtually every superlative was shrouded in suspicion. The calendar barely turned before another scandal broke.
The BCS has stripped the University of Southern California of its 2004 football national championship. Of course, this stems from the ineligibility of former Heisman Trophy winner Reggie Bush, who was found to have received improper benefits during his playing career. And of course, last summer, USC was banned from a bowl game for 2 years and given scholarship reductions as a result of the finding.
I'm deeply sorry about the young selfish mistakes I made, and I just want to apologize along with everyone up here for our actions.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Burns and I'm here with Virginia Fishwick, and we're presenting on behalf of Team 1 about NCAA rule violations. Today we're going to discuss some recent NCAA rule violations, their impact, and how we made an assessment tool. Additionally, we have determined some essential strategies for evaluating marketing crises from our research that can be applied to fields other than the sports arena. Since 1996, there have been 50 instances of what the NCAA considers major infractions with Division I college football programs. In the most recent cases, major infractions involve activity that provides an extensive recruiting or competitive advantage to one team. These violations range from impermissible recruiting calls to facilitating widespread academic cheating. If a university finds itself in the midst of a violation, they will also be faced with the reality that there is not a sufficient tool available to assess and gauge their current situation. The school may have to refer to past experience, precedents involving other institutions, or anecdotal evidence when assessing the evidence and severity of their crisis. In the context of this study, a crisis refers to a situation that has reached a critical phase and requires an immediate decision. The purpose of this study is to develop a tool with which a university can judge the severity of a crisis and use this judgment as a basis for action. To begin with, we'd like to highlight some recent examples that you may be familiar with. Examples of schools with major NCAA infractions since 1996 include the University of South Carolina, Ohio State University, Texas Tech University, the University of Connecticut, the University of Southern California, the University of Tennessee, Florida State University, the University of Alabama, Arizona State University, and the University of Oklahoma, to just name a few. Now we'll look at a few of these examples more in depth. At Ohio State, 3 former staff members assisted 61 student athletes in committing academic fraud. The academic support unit employees provided answers to tests and in some cases wrote papers for student athletes after logging into their online accounts. Current students and university employees were involved. This was an academic fraud case. It happened over the last 2 years. They were self-reported, and the duration of the infraction was 1 to 3 years. This didn't just involve the football program, so this was multiple sports. The penalty: Ohio State faced probation for 4 years, reduction in financial aid, and a vacation of record, which means all the wins are wiped from the record and any titles are forfeited. At the University of Connecticut, the NCAA and the school have been investigating the men's basketball program since shortly after a report by Yahoo Sports in March of 2009 that former team manager Josh Knockemson helped guide recruit Nate Miles to Connecticut, giving him lodging, transportation, meals, and representation. As a former team manager, Knockemson is considered a representative of UConn's athletic interests by the NCAA and is therefore prohibited from giving Miles anything of value. The school said that it found the basketball staff exchanged more than 1,400 calls and 1,100 text messages with Knockemson between June 2005 and December 2008. The involved parties were current players, former players, and university employees. It was classed as a failure to create an atmosphere of compliance. This happened over the past 2 years, and it was reported by an outside source. The duration of the infraction is 2 years, and it did just involve the men's basketball program. As a penalty, head coach Jim Calhoun was suspended for 3 conference games during the 2011-2012 season. The scholarships were reduced for the next 3 years, and they also faced recruiting restrictions, disassociation of a booster, and 3 years probation. At Florida State University, former tutors for academic personnel participated in unethical tutoring practices by providing correct answers for exams, creating study guides that were essentially all the answers to tests, and this was not accessible to other students. All of these instances were supported by the academic advisor, which was in effect the tutor's boss. The involved parties were current players, former players, university employees, university officials, and athletic directors. The type of infraction was academic fraud and impermissible benefits. Time elapsed since occurrence was over 2 to 5 years ago. This was also reported by a third party and happened over 1 to 3 years. The scope of infraction was multiple sports, as it did not just involve the football program. As a penalty, the team faced probation for 4 years, reduction in financial aid, and they also had a vacation of their record. I'm now going to turn it over to Virginia, and she's going to go over how we created our NCAA assessment tool. So as Grace mentioned, we've put together an assessment tool that can be used for assessing NCAA marketing crises related to NCAA violations. And when we assessed a marketing crisis, we determined that the most important factor was to start by defining the criteria that directly affects the crisis severity. And so for NCAA rules violations, we determined that, and these categories listed here, were the main items that directly affected the severity of each crisis. So to begin, we wanted to look at the involved parties. Was it just a recruit or a player, or did it go much deeper than that with involvement of coaches or even the athletic director and university officials? Then we wanted to look at the type of infraction. So was it based around recruiting or academics or giving impermissible benefits to current players, or was there actual criminal involvement? The time elapsed since the occurrence, and that's the time between the occurrence of the event or the infraction and the event being reported. And then the reporting party. Did the school own up to it and self-report, or was it reported by a third party or peer? How long did the infraction take place? So were recruiting violations happening over multiple years, for instance? And then the scope. Was it one sport or multiple sports? And we also believe that these indicators can be generalized for any marketing crisis. And so here that's what I've done. I've generalized the same type of criteria for a general crisis that any business might face. So we'll look at the involved parties, and we've changed that here to executives, associates, third parties, and customers. So it may not always be someone working at the company that's involved in the crisis. The Tylenol crisis is a good example where it wasn't Tylenol themselves that was putting the syringes in. Because they didn't have the proper safety mechanisms in place on their packaging, customers were able to go into pharmacies and put in the syringes. And so that was kind of the situation there. So the type of crisis, is it a safety issue like with Tylenol? Was it an ethics issue? Was there a financial issue where there was embezzlement or something along those lines? The time elapsed since the occurrence, again, this is very similar to what we put together for our NCAA situation. The reporting party, again, same thing. Was it self-reported, a peer, or maybe a news source? The duration of the infraction, and then the scope. And here, instead of it being one sport versus multiple sports, it could be one product line or division. So Procter & Gamble, for instance, has many different product lines and brands, or it could be enterprise-wide. And so the tool that we had developed, we kind of took these factors and we looked at a bunch of examples, and we put those into an Excel spreadsheet and used some custom formulas, and we created a tool to evaluate this crisis based on the criteria that we've set out. And as I mentioned, we use known data to assist in the creation of this tool, and we feel that this tool can also be generalized for any marketing crisis. So now I'll show you a demo of the tool that we put together. So I'd like to start by showing you the data that we used and that we put into Excel in order to compare different infractions and different crisis situations side by side so that we could use them in the formulas for our crisis assessment tool. So as you can see, we have over 50 different infractions that we analyzed and put the information into this tool. And we looked at information that is the same information in our crisis assessment tool. So specifically, we looked at the involved parties, we looked at the infraction type, we looked at the time elapsed since the infraction, we looked at who reported it, as well as the duration of the infraction, and the scope, whether it was multiple sports or a single sport. And so all of that information is brought together here in our spreadsheet, and then we put together some formulas that pull this information and help us, with our crisis assessment tool, assess a future hypothetical market crisis situation. And I'll show you how that works now. So this is our crisis assessment tool. Again, as you see on the left-hand side, we have our different criteria. And then on the right side, in the right column, we have a place where you can mark an X if applicable. If you mark an X, there's a formula associated with each one of these fields that then takes that information, figures out how much that particular criteria affects the crisis and whether or not it's a high risk or it makes it more severe or it may be kind of a less severe situation. Calculates that, and then at the bottom here you'll see where we'll find a total score, and then that score will dictate the crisis severity, which in turn dictates the likely punishment that will be received by that university. So I'd like to walk you through an actual example we're going to discuss the University of Connecticut and the infractions that happened with their basketball program between June 2005 and December 2008. And if you'll remember from Gracie's portion of the presentation earlier, the NCAA began investigating them based on the fact that their former team manager, Josh Knockinson, helped guide their recruit Nate Miles to Connecticut by giving him lodging and transportation. They also said that they found over 1,400 calls and 1,100 text messages between Knockinson and folks that he was recruiting. So we're going to go through and do that actual situation in our crisis assessment tool. So there was a recruit involved here, and in some other parts of the arrangement there were former players involved, as well as a coach. So a good bit of involvement here. On the infraction, there were recruiting. As far as impermissible benefit, Nate Miles was provided with lodging, transportation, meals, and representation. And then there was also impermissible benefits given to current players. The time elapsed section, it was between 0 and 2 years between the time that it elapsed and the time that it was reported, and it was self-reported. And then the duration of the infraction, unfortunately for UConn, was over 5 years, so that falls in this 3+ years category. However, it was only in one sport. And as you see, as I've gone through the tool, this number down here, the total score, has changed. So this total score is a 27, and the crisis severity is severe, and the likely punishment would be 2 to 3 years of restrictions. So let's go back and see what the actual restrictions for UConn was. And the actual punishment was that head coach Jim Calhoun was suspended for 3 conference games during the 2011 and 2012 season. Scholarship reductions were put in place for 3 years. So here we've seen that the crisis assessment tool is correct. We predicted that 2 to 3 years of restrictions would be in place, and indeed scholarship reductions for 3 years were put in place. There were also recruiting restrictions and a dissociation of a booster, and they were put on 3 years of probation. So again, 3 years of restrictions. And so that's how an example works within our crisis assessment tool. This was an actual situation so that we could show you exactly what happened and the result and how the crisis assessment tool works. But it would work in much the same way for a new or hypothetical marketing crisis situation. And if we were to update this tool and change the involved parties to the more generic information that I showed you earlier, if we were to make this any crisis, so executives, associates, third parties, change the type of infraction to safety, ethics, or financial types of crises, and then again change the scope of the infraction here to one product line or enterprise-wide, we could enter in other data from other similar situations to that specific company and use the same crisis assessment tool for any industry or any situation. So we came up with a couple of key conclusions and observations based on our tool. Our main conclusion is that the key to assessing any marketing crisis is to know and understand the contributing factors. And so when you're assessing a marketing crisis, you need to look at the factors that we went over and discussed and the factors that we incorporated into our tool. And then you need to create a tool similar to the tool that we created by looking at other similar past infractions and other similar past marketing crises and putting that data into a tool that then can be used to generalize your current situation with past situations so you know how you might be able to react. And one final observation that we tended to notice throughout the 50 different NCAA violations that we looked at, and then also within our tool, is that the higher the official in any type of crisis of this nature, the more serious the effect of the NCAA rule violations. And this is something, again, that we think the trend applies outside of the NCAA and outside of sports. In fact, we think this applies across the board for marketing crises. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.